A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a Directors Club United Kingdom Innovation Exchange webinar, today showcasing Coveo. My name is John Snow. I am the founder of Directors Club United Kingdom, and today we're going to be looking at the innovations of Coveo and addressing in particular the title, Building a Foundation for Transformative Self-Service. Our agenda for today is we've got a main presentation from the CMO of Coveo, Mark Floysand, and he will be addressing the title that I've just said. And then we'll be following that with a Q&A session where you, the audience, can ask the questions. Now, during that Q&A or during the whole presentation, if you've got a question that pops into your mind, you don't have to wait until the Q&A session itself. You can click the question function on your control panel, and you can enter any question as simple or as complex as you like, and we'll try and address as many of those during the Q&A session. If you're watching the recording and you have some questions for Mark, or then there will be some details coming up towards the end, and we will also be sending out some contact details via email. So just one thing, if you are posting questions, please don't use the chat function because we won't be monitoring that during the broadcast. So our speaker for today is Mark Floysand, and let me just check that you're there and you can hear me and I can hear you. So Mark, welcome. You're in California, I think.
I'm indeed, bright and early. Thank you, John.
Great stuff. Now, Mark was born in the UK, raised in South Africa, and now lives in California, where he's Chief Marketing Officer of Coveo. He has an MBA from the University of Durham and has worked at a range of top brands, including Apple, Adobe, and SAP. And Mark will be presenting to the title, once again, Building a Foundation for Transformative Self-Service. So, Mark, without a further ado, I'm going to hand over to you and make you the presenter. So just bear with me one moment. I'll hand you over the slide deck, and you can accept that. And then there we go. Mark, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. I very much look forward to the next 35-40 minutes and obviously some questions thereafter. As John said, we'll be focusing today on building a foundation for transformative self-service. Maybe just a minute or two about Coveo if you've not heard of us before. We're an organization actually headquartered in Quebec City in Canada, with a strong focus on helping customers improve their self-service capability and improve the overall presentation of the most relevant information to customers, partners, and employees. And you'll see that borne out as we go through this. I thought what I might do is start with some context by giving you some information from an organization called the TSIA. The TSIA is, in fact, the Technology Services Industry Association. And is a firm that effectively works with high-tech organizations to really identify how are they going about delivering service, what improvements can be made, and they're very much the industry body for high-tech firms that have things like tech support teams, customer service desks, and looking to improve the service that they provide to their customers. And what you see, for example, on this chart is, first and foremost, that on their annual channel preference survey, some interesting things surface from the top. Unsurprisingly, when asked, what do you prefer to find for product support, what channels do you prefer, Google is in fact the primary place. So the first thing people are doing when they're looking to solve a problem is trying to help themselves. And one of the, obviously top of mind ways to do that is to go search for it. And that's been consistent year on year. What that says is that for them to be serviced, there needs to be a lot of information available to them that can be indexed by Google and ultimately lead them to, your website or whatever else happens to be. But look at some of the other things in there. So second place is self-service, which has gone up sharply, the orange bars being last year, the blue bars being this year, sharply to 80%. What this is telling you is customers prefer to look after themselves. Chat has gone up sharply from 36% to 60%. So as a medium, using chat as a basis for communications has risen. Community sharply up, over 50% respondents. YouTube, massive growth, nearly 50% of people turning to YouTube for information about product support. And obviously some new things like video chat and so on that simply didn't even feature last year. Look at the bottom. The bottom of this is telling. Email goes from a low of 22 to 10%. Phone, 15% to 12%. The message here is that people don't want to talk to contact centers. They want to be able to service themselves. They want to use tools they're familiar with and things that they trust, like other people's voices on communities, other people's videos on YouTube, and so on. So there's a lot in this that gives us a very clear indication of how people prefer to self-service and how that trend is continuing to grow. The irony of it is that for organizations that embrace it, it's also cheaper. So if we look at a strong self-service scenario where things like information are being readily provided to customers in a way that is intuitive for them to find, and they can get the most relevant answer quickly without needing to revert to agent-assisted support or other channels that are not about them helping themselves. There's a fundamental average price difference for you as a company in terms of the cost per incident. This is an average cost or a blended cost across all channels, but the more you can drive self-service, the lower that cost becomes on the left because it's cheaper. So ironically, we have a situation where customers prefer it and it costs less. So this seems to be a very clear set of business metrics that would compel the justification of embarking on a self-service enablement process. There's some other data from the TSIA which further re-emphasizes this. A strong self-service strategy actually increases employee retention. So, for example, when we look at metrics like employee satisfaction, where there are strong self-service capabilities, the staff are happier too. And that actually makes intuitive sense. They're engaged in doing things that are perhaps more interesting, that are more challenging, the sort of things that might come up occasionally that require in-depth research and discovering new ways of solving customers' problems, as opposed to run-of-the-mill routine things that could well be answered by a document or a piece of information on a website that customers could find for themselves. So in that scenario, employee satisfaction goes up sharply. What's also interesting is that it has a direct impact on employee attrition. So in other words, where you're having to have employees and support staff and so on take a lot of those routine calls, the boredom rate is pretty high, the tedium is high, the attrition goes up accordingly. The corollary is where there is strong self-service, people stay employed longer. This has direct impact on things like training costs, times to proficiency, and ultimately, this actually goes and further drives things like customer satisfaction. Because clearly where the customers are able to support themselves, they are happy. The irony of it is that even if they do have to ultimately default to a customer service desk or an agent-assisted route because they weren't able to self-service, those agents are more proficient, they are happier, they know more about their product because they've been around longer, and that too drives an increase in customer satisfaction. And if you look at the difference between 4.1 and to 4.7 on a 5-point scale, this is substantial on the right-hand side. So overall customer support satisfaction goes up sharply where strong self-service exists and is present. And it's not just about cost saving and CSAT, it also drives revenue. So what the TSIA have observed is a very strong correlation between organizations that have robust self-service capabilities and overall company growth, and indeed, of course, support revenue growth. So the irony of it is that by providing better capability for customers to look after themselves, it actually has an impact not just on the bottom line from a cost-saving point of view, but it actually drives the top line as well. So these are all very compelling metrics, as I say, taken from the TSIA's annual benchmark. And what it does, I think, is always provides us as a, obviously a technology vendor, an interesting set of insights into how the overall high-tech industry is behaving. But perhaps more importantly, as a bellwether of what's going to happen in other industries that might be not quite as early to adopt some of those new technologies and capabilities as most high-tech firms, what does good look like as self-service improves in other sectors as well? So whether you're in the high-tech sector or not, this data still holds true. It's just that it's measured early there because of the nature of that sector. So what does it look like? What does transformative self-service actually look like? And to do this, I'll give you kind of a theoretical context and then actually show a worked example, if you like. And so, what you'll see on the screen looks like a fairly busy set of information. So let me walk through it, and we'll use this as a context for then showing the customer example. Fundamentally, we have a point of view that to actually be relevant to customers requires a very solid foundation of things that you can put in place within your organization that ultimately feed the most relevant information to the various channels or touch points that customers may interact with. And as you saw on the first slide, there are many. It's no longer just the phone. In fact, phone and email are, as we saw on that opening slide from the TSIA, the least interesting to customers. So start thinking about where customers may find information on your websites. Are there community properties that you have? Even in commerce, can people self-service and find information on your store? Are there support portals that are specifically set up for that that environment, as it were? And then equally internally, what are the sort of capabilities that your own teams may want to interact with to find information for themselves in the service of customers? Even down to the point of, can it be built into the product itself to enable customers to frankly find the answers they need inside your product? And we'll see an example of that shortly. All of these we think of as touch points. Now, what's important about those touch points is that they obviously provide an intuitive interface to customers through which they can readily navigate and find the information they're looking for in logical, structured fashions that are well organized, with the most relevant information surfacing to the top, so they don't have to go hunt for it. And that comes from several places. Firstly, the ability to find that information and unify it across your organization and make it available to be served up to customers. And to understand how it's being used and use that, if you like, usage information, the interactions that people have with it, to feed back into the process to make things more and more relevant and more personal as we go. And a large part of what takes place along the way is all of that analytics being fed into machine learning systems which thrive on lots of data to predict and make the most relevant recommendations to people in this interface. So the point is that there are many touch points. You want to make sure that there's a consistency to how people can engage with it, that they're accessing all of the potential information across your organization that could be brought to bear, that the data is being analyzed to learn what is most relevant to your customers and continuously fed back in this cycle. What does that look like in practice? Well, as an example, let's look at, in fact, one of my former employers, a company called Adobe. Many of you may know Adobe. Adobe is a software firm, and one of their flagship products is Photoshop. So they have within Photoshop is part of the Creative Cloud, and that creative community is also supported by a website that enables them to go and find information about how to better use Photoshop and obviously other products as well. and indeed supported by agents in a contact center in the event that people can't find what they're looking for. So what Adobe did was recognize they had information across a myriad of different places: product documentation, information in a learning management system, product bug fix data in their own Jira development systems, on their websites, and so on and so forth, even in their own CRM systems. And using Coveo, they're able to unify all of that information and put it to work. So what happens in this scenario is that customers can go to the website and they can search for information and find the most relevant answer on that site. Well, that's useful. But what's more useful is that that same information informs what answers would be given actually inside the product, and what answers would be presented to the agent to recommend when they're talking to someone on the phone. And indeed, any interactions over here feed there, and so on and so forth. And so in practice, what that looks like is that if I am inside the product, so in this case, we're actually looking at a screenshot of Photoshop 2017, and I go to the help function, you'll see over here, I have the ability to search for help inside the product. And in this case, if I search for a term like align objects, you can see that the first result that comes up is how to align objects with guides in Photoshop. Now, interestingly, for those with very good eyes and a good resolution screen, the small print of this URL says helpx.adobe.com. That's their support website. This is the most relevant piece of information to present in the product to a Photoshop user in their flow of work. And that's been learned by Coveo under the hood based on the interactions that people have had on the website. And of course, because it's in Photoshop, it's filtered and tuned to recommend, or to effectively recommend, things that are more relevant to Photoshop, because it's intuitive that it's inside the product. And equally, if they want to learn additional tools and tricks, there are other results that come up as well. The point is that this is a point of interaction for a customer that is absolutely going to help them avoid needing to even leave the product they're involved with, even have to consider going out to a website, let alone interacting on the phone or writing an email to someone. So this is the degree to which self-service can be enabled even inside a product itself. What's also important is to recognize that there's a lot of information that customers provide organizations in the way they engage with them that can also be put to work. So if we think of the experience that Adobe customers have on that support website, as an anonymous visitor, if they go over there and they type in a term like crop, well, this is a verb that is in common parlance across the whole Creative Suite product offering. You can, crop Acrobat pages and crop photos in Photoshop Elements and crop pictures in Illustrator, and these are all relevant. They can, of course, be easily filtered and navigated down based on these facets that are presented here. And that's an example of simple, intuitive user interfaces to enable customers to very quickly navigate through these results to find what they want. And the data is being presented based on what other anonymous visitors have found most useful, by observing what they've clicked on and making sure that the most relevant information rises to the top. So that's all good. But it's more interesting if we happen to know that someone is already a Photoshop user, because then bringing that information to bear as well changes these results for the same term. So same website, same term, let me find information about crop. But in this case, Coveo knows that this is a Photoshop user from their prior interactions, and therefore prioritizes those results that have been most relevant to other Photoshop users. The point here is that all of this interaction information can be put to work to provide the most relevant content that is personal to each and every individual based on their unique scenario. And the more relevant it is, the more likely it is to enable that customer to self-service first time, and therefore, make them happier, lower your costs, and drive up revenue. And this stuff works. So in Adobe's scenario, we saw, for example, a rapid adoption of the search capability itself. So literally double the number of people actually using and finding information, a huge drop in customer effort and a massive decrease in, let's call them no results, where they weren't exposing information for customers and therefore ended up that customer having to call a contact center. The more information we could expose, the more information was available, the far fewer no results they had, and hey, guess what? Lower costs. And then equally, a growing rise in conversion. In other words, people actually clicking through this information, using it and taking advantage of it. So that's a worked example. What is that roadmap though? How do you embark on the same kind of journey that someone like an Adobe has done? And I think the most important thing is to first and foremost think about, how do you make relevant information available? How do you effectively bring that concept of relevance into everything you do from a self-service point of view? And part of it is that there's just an awful lot of headwind, if you like, in terms of trying to bring these relevant self-service experiences to bear. They are things like, there's information locked up in a myriad of different applications, database silos, different channels. There's interaction data across different things. One doesn't talk to the other. Very frequently, we see that the kind of information that people need is also not connected to, frankly, the channels that they want to put in place. It's very hard for me to self-service on a website if the data that's being presented back to me isn't available, pure and simple. The links are broken, practically. No baseline to track progress. So how does one measure what success looks like? How do you know if you've made improvements or not? And because this should be a process and an ongoing operational improvement, how does one measure that not just once, but on an ongoing basis? It's also very important to be able to take advantage of analytics to see what's working, learn what's working. And very frequently we see that firms simply aren't tracking this stuff, let alone measuring it. And perhaps most important, there isn't a unified view of the customer experience. I'm sure everyone on this call has got, or is midway or embarking on some kind of customer journey, customer experience initiative, digital transformation process, call it what you want. But in terms of responding to modern customer expectations, no one can afford to be left behind. Yet the reality of it is that many firms don't yet have a view of what that customer experience looks like, and therefore are finding it hard to bring relevance to bear because of the abstraction of what that should look like. And it takes many forms. Think of the number of different ways that people can self-service. Some of it clearly is external. If we think of customers in a public environment, being able to self-service in the product or on websites, as we spoke about. But it's just as applicable internally for employees or agents in a contact center to be able to self-service themselves, or in a channel organization where your consumers aren't necessarily your immediate customers. Your immediate customers may be retailers or dealers or brokers or agents. How are they able to self-service and again enable them to be happier and more loyal to you, more likely to recommend your product to their customers? Every sort of touch point, whether it's partners, customers, or employees, can benefit from improvement in self-service. So how do you go about it? I'll take this in kind of 5 steps, and we'll walk through each of these in more detail. But in brief, firstly, have a process to capture and reuse knowledge. We'll talk about that. Provide a unified access to that information or that knowledge. Fundamentally understand what metrics are important in the process. Start to embrace the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning to drive this relevance and personalization at scale. And then learn from that behavior of not just the individual, but every one of those folks, the crowd of people that are engaging with you, to continuously improve. So first and foremost, having a process to capture and reuse knowledge is all about understanding the principles of knowledge-centered support. So how do you continue to create content that is the result of having solved a problem? Example, if someone is talking to an agent in a contact center about a product issue they've had, and it's new, and the agent is able to do some research for that customer, find out what the answer is, work with the product teams, whatever they have to do behind the scenes to find that result. And that agent is then readily able to publish it and make it available for other agents and indeed for customers themselves. Well, the next time that another customer has that problem, they're able to discover it on the website and take care of themselves. So very important that content is created as a byproduct of solving these issues. And of course, what that does is it means that your content portfolio will evolve over time based on what's important. What's also, implicit in that is that that which is less important is pushed down in terms of relevance, that there are technologists taking care of it to make the most relevant content surface to the top. And also understand that, part of those principles are about ensuring that people get some sort of reward for collaborating and sharing. That's not just internally, that's also within your customer community itself. If you think of things like customer support, bulletin boards, the sort of places where customers talk amongst themselves about you, that is a gold mine of information. And the more you can provide reward to customers for sharing their experiences, the better it is. The second piece of this is unifying access to that knowledge. So by understanding where all this information lives and making sure that it is actually all available to your customers, this is fundamentally if you like, the raw material that is going to deliver them the answers that they need. And what's important is that this is comprehensive. It's no good if one has to go to one experience to find one set of answers, doesn't find them, has to then turn to another thing, and it's almost like a digital paper chase, trying to track down where the right answer exists. People haven't got time for that, nor do they have the patience. By unifying everything into a single index enables one set of results to deliver the most relevant content, irrespective of its type, its kind, or where it lives. So whether it's a video, whether it's a product PDF, whether it's an article that's been written by an agent or a blog post from a customer, shouldn't matter. If it's the most relevant information, it needs to rise to the top and be presented to customers intuitively so that they can get on with their lives. The third piece of this is understanding which metrics matter. And if we think of it, traditionally, people would look at support, particularly in contact centers, with metrics like things like average handle times, how long, are people taking on calls, how frequently is the first contact resolved, so first contact resolution, or how often are customers having to, be called back or call back to finally get their answer, and what's the overall cost per incident. Those are fine, but from a self-service point of view, they don't tell the complete picture. What's more interesting is to focus on the outcomes. So what answers were resolved? What's the sort of percentage resolution of answers across channels? What's the rate of self-service success? Suddenly we're not talking about measuring calls, but measuring success on, for example, a self-service website. How do you do that? Known to new case ratios. So what this refers to is this notion of how often are your agents solving the same thing again and again versus new things. And that's a warning sign, because again, if we find they're solving the same question time and again, it means they're not able to publish that content and make it available for customers to find themselves. Recall the TSIA data. That's going to have a direct impact on agent attrition. It's going to drive up your training costs, and it means you're constantly going to be trying to hire new people because their job satisfaction is low. Fourthly, embrace the power of AI. And what we mean by this is, if you think of the fact that all of that content exists across an entire ecosystem of your organization, firstly, how do you pull it all together? If you start marrying that with the if you like, the context of what people are doing, the ways that they're engaging, is it in the product? Is it on a website? Is it in a chat session? And you combine that with the behavioral analytics of who did what was the wisdom that could be received, if you like, from looking at all of the interactions that organizations have had with your company as a whole. If you add all of that stuff together and feed it into the machine learning capabilities, the more data, the more they learn, then you're able to start providing the most relevant information to each and every person in a way that is highly scalable. This just can't work by hand. To unify all of your interaction data and kind of cross-reference that against all of the content in your organization and cherry pick the most salient stuff for people who look similar to folks that went through those journeys before, just requires computing power. And AI can help do that to provide the most relevant information each and every time. And implicit in that is this notion of learning from the behavior of your crowd of customers or partners or indeed employees. What is it in volume that the data provides? Well, you can start learning things like what content gaps exist. People were looking for information and just couldn't find it. Well, that's a clue to have the content team go produce something, whether it's marketing or product or support. There's clearly a gap and it can be filled. What are the query click-throughs? So how frequently are people actually accessing information that's being recommended? The more relevant it is, the more you'd expect to see that go up. What's the average click rank? So think of this as, we've all got experience of using Google in our day-to-day lives. The most important results should be those that are nearest the top. Well, the closer to the top, in other words, the click rank, the further up to the top you are, the more relevant the information is that you're providing your customers. Think about the fact that increasingly people are trying to look after themselves on their mobile phone, to and from work, on the go, wherever it happens to be, in a store. And there just isn't that much real estate on a phone that's visible, certainly to someone of my age. And so I want to make sure that I'm not having to peer and scroll through, an entire web page of data and try and cherry pick and zoom in to find the answer. I want it to be the top first or second result. So click rank is important. And then ultimately, how many people are actually clicking through? How many people are engaging with the results that are being presented? And obviously being able to continually see those usage analytics helps you better understand your users. An example, if we look at things like what we see on the top left here, of content gaps. So this is a worked example where these are actual terms that people have been searching for in an organization and couldn't get any information. So this clearly says there's a gap. There's a gap between what people are looking for and what they were presented with that clearly tells this organization that they've got to go do some more work. Equally, what are the kind of documents that created cases? This is telling because it enables us to start looking at examples of what information is actually driving case creation and what are those that actually create case deflection. So when we talk about case deflection, what are the articles, documents, pieces of content that enabled people to look after themselves and did not cause them to generate a case in your contact center? Very important, I mentioned, to look at that query. So, where are people coming to your organization and what is driving the sources of self-service? And in this case, we can see that the self-service website's important, but for this particular client, their community section and their help section are particularly important as well. What's the click-through rate in terms of these? How frequently are people actually, clicking on the case creation page? The lower this goes, the better it is. And so, if you think of what we're measuring there, we're starting to look at things like if someone creates a support case and, sends that off to the support center, someone's now going to have to start working on it. It is no longer self-service. So all of these metrics constantly being monitored and measured provide insight into how well, your machine's working. I mentioned that click rank score. You can see this is pretty good. So the average click rank here means that results that are being presented to customers when they try and self-service, the results they're clicking on are on average between second and third result. It's pretty good. Less than 2 is even better. And so these things can be monitored to look for constant operational improvement. And this stuff makes a difference. It has a real impact. So if we look at some of our customers' results, and here are some of our clients along the bottom, really you can look at metrics across all elements of customer service. So whether it's improvements in the customer experience itself, whether it's the ability for customers to self-service by a sharp lift in that case deflection rate, whether it's a lift in direct CSAT attributable to this process, whether it's a reduction in how long it's taking to solve cases, and indeed measured, seeing an increase in agent tenure as a result of it, employees becoming more proficient and enjoying their work more because, again, if you like, the mundane stuff is being taken off the table and being done by self-service. Improvements in partner success. As I said, this isn't just about customers. VMware works through a network of partners and have seen a significant improvement in taking the same approach to their partner channel. And obviously, as I said, another example of case deflection with Brocade. These are all measured results that have direct business impact and are ultimately driving results in terms of lowering costs, improving CSAT, and correlating with increases in revenue as well. How do you get there? Well, I put this up as more just as a reassurance, perhaps, that it's a journey. And we think of that journey as one of becoming more mature around providing relevant information. And in simple terms, the further along you get in this journey, the more proficient people become, the more you're using intelligent information rather than just serving up content, the more you're going from simply reacting to what people are asking for to responding with more relevant information, starting to proactively suggest additional things that might be useful to them, and ultimately predicting what they will need next, where you're bringing to bear things like machine learning capabilities to drive and predict what sort of self-learning assets people might use to help them as well. So we actually walk our customers through this process and very much help them go sort of above water here and become increasingly proficient and ultimately, up to this top level of relevance maturity as they start to bring more content to bear, take advantage of machine learning capability and deliver recommendations to customers that help them out. So really, I guess, if you're thinking of next steps or where to go from this, there are several things you can do after this webinar. If you're more technically minded and you happen to be using something like Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics 365 for CRM, we actually have apps on the App Exchange or the App Source that you can go ahead, look for and try. So searching for Coveo on your favorite business app store, you're welcome to go and install us and have a look. If you're not an admin of these applications and more interested in it from a business standpoint, feel free to give us a call. Equally, if you want a copy of these slides or the benchmark data from TSIA itself, or just to chat, you can obviously just feel free to contact us at webinar@coveo.com and we'll be happy to be in touch. So several different ways that you can kind of take it from here. But at this point, John, I'll hand it back to you and ask if there are any questions.
Mark, great stuff, great insight. As always, Coveo on the cutting edge in the self-service world, and it's always good every year to catch up with you guys to see what you're doing new. And it's, that was a fascinating insight, and we've definitely got some questions. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching the live broadcast, you can hit your question button on your control panel and pop a question in there. We'll try and address as many of those in the sort of 15 or so minutes that we've got left on this live webinar. If you're watching the rebroadcast, the video, then perhaps drop an email there to webinar@coveo.com, and I'm sure it'll get through to the relevant people. Now, in terms of Mark, in terms of my first question, very much a part of, if an organization is considering setting up self-service to supplement its human service channels, What sort of people do they need in place to start the process of getting the knowledge together and then starting to sort of plan out the infrastructure and how it's going to work? So what sort of job titles are needed to get going with self-service?
That's a great question. Well, what we've tended to find in terms of our engagements are they're very often with the folks that are responsible for improving things like the community. So very often we will see community managers asking how they can provide more information to their community members who are already active. Where there isn't a community in place yet, then it may indeed come from the support manager who's saying, look, I have an operational overhead of my agents and I'm limited in my budget. How can I find ways of providing this additional support channel in self-service that would supplement my agent-assisted support? So our inquiries tend to come from different roles. I think the other thing we learned from is that many organizations these days also have a customer success team. And these are very often the people who are sitting with customers, helping them become proficient on products that they've just bought. And they're a goldmine of information in terms of the resources that they turn to help customers become more effective. I think the important thing, though, in embarking on a self-service journey is, if before you start thinking about systems and process and people, sometimes it's just helpful to try and take a view of, what would good look like? What would good look like in the eyes of the customer? And what are the sort of information sources that exist inside my company that could potentially unlock those answers? We typically find that customers will go through a process of discovery, very often just on a whiteboard, of saying, where does all our stuff live? Okay, we've got, product information in Google Drive locked up in PDF files. Can customers see that? No, they can't. We've got, bug reports in a project, in a bug reporting system, and answers that have been provided by an engineering team. Are those answers available to customers? No. So simply starting to map out where information exists that might be helpful to customers is a really good place to start, because that's also going to help you think about how to ultimately connect to that information and bring it to bear.
And therefore, if you're setting up a project team to let's say start brainstorming with the whiteboard in terms of where information is and who has access to it, etc., is it important to have representatives in that project team from across the traditional silos and sort of functional departments of the organization?
Absolutely, and cross-functional, I think, is the important word in that, John, because what's implicit perhaps in this information is that it is in different departments. One of the challenges I think that we find, particularly with larger firms, enterprises that have got several decades of systems and process in place, and indeed people supporting those systems and processes, is that they have effectively built up data silos, and silos that are both the content that customers could potentially take advantage of, and indeed interaction data silos of things like web traffic on one environment, or analytics data on an e-commerce store, or customer information in a CRM system that aren't connected and don't talk to each other. So you have to bring people from each of those departments to the table to join the dots again, because organizations typically have to keep reminding themselves that their customers or consumers are individuals. And to make this information personal and relevant to them, we have to think about that individual trying to navigate this enterprise from the outside in. And we as people, we as consumers, don't think about data silos and business divisions, and we don't expect to have to go and look in different places. It should be much more intuitively presented to us. So that's why it's important to have a cross-functional team that can bring to bear where the information lives, and often are the folks holding the keys to the kingdom to those different data systems and content repositories.
And is the is the chief customer officer or chief customer experience officer or director of customer service, are they the natural people to be at the helm of an initiative like this?
Very frequently, we see them leading it, and some organizations have those roles, and some take a view that the customer experience is sort of central and a shared responsibility throughout an organization. And so we see both flavors, and I think it depends on, to some degree, the ethos of the firm. Some organizations would prefer to hold a single person accountable for improving that customer experience. Clearly, in terms of reporting and driving programs forward and leading projects and initiatives, that's helpful. But it comes back to your point of this is a cross-functional effort, and so the more that the customer experience can be brought front and center to really be every team's responsibility, and having people realize their role and their part that they play in improving it actually makes a huge difference. That's often one of the challenges that we see firms undergoing, which is actually the kind of change management and the cultural transformation of being okay turning some of this information loose. The more this information can be provided with security and the right access of information being provided to the right people, the more it can be liberated to be put in the hands of customers to help them help themselves. The faster organizations realize the benefits of lower costs, better CSAT, and starting to impact on things like customer repeat purchases and so on. So I'd say it's a shared responsibility that it should be company-wide, but frequently we do see a customer experience leader being the one that's driving it forward and carrying the charge.
And in terms of the types of organizations that sort of in your company's experience to date have most benefited from the introduction of self-service, is software companies the sort of the low-hanging fruit, as it were, or are there examples of many other different types of organizations that have or business verticals that have shown the benefit of self-service?
Yeah, great question. We saw obviously in the software and the high-tech sector rapid adoption of this. I think because if you think of their customers and many of us on this call are typical customers of these high-tech firms these days, our expectations have gone up sharply. And so they found that their customers were just very demanding. They were web literate, they were mobile savvy, they were turning to Google to find information and being frustrated if it didn't exist, and putting pressure on those organizations to respond. So I think that's why we saw an initial early adoption in the high-tech sector. It's the nature of their own customers. But that has since spread. If you think of your classic sort of technology adoption life cycle and crossing the chasm and all those things, you can see the high-tech sector as being perhaps visionary early adopter. We've seen the early majority in terms of things like other complex manufacturing firms that have got the same issue. They have a complex product that is managed and consumed by a sophisticated customer who wants the ability to look after themselves. So high-tech complex manufacture, B2B manufacturing, we're also rapid adopters. And then what we've seen is in things like financial services, and telco, both of whom unfortunately have had historic reputations for delivering relatively poor customer service through their contact centers and trying to deflect us away from talking to their agents through things like interactive voice routing, which is just frustrating for many people. The sheer volume of complaints have driven adoption of self-service in those sectors as well. And again, if you think of it, it's because between now and say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, consumers are more proficient, they're more technically enabled. Most people grew up digitally enabled these days. And so what that means is that large organizations simply have to respond to the preferences that their customers are exhibiting. if we go right back to where we started on this call, that TSI data is really telling when you have things like customers preferring YouTube over talking to one of your own employees as a source of trusted data. Why? Because so much information is now available on YouTube that can be brought to bear that's been created by other people just like them.
Yeah, Mike, just on that point, do you think those statistics you just referenced are a good indicator of how people's preferences for wanting to access information are changing as generations grow up with things like YouTube and other forms of sort of finding information in sort of video or in obviously in sort of search engine text type formats? Is this now how people want to access information? They don't want to do it through the contact center, speaking to a person, or perhaps web chatting, etc. Perhaps all that's becoming a little bit old hat. What's your view on the sort of the channel preference of the future?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So what we're seeing very clearly in the data is rapid adoption of let's call them web and mobile-based experiences that do not involve having to talk to someone, that do not involve traditional things like email, and even certain types of chat are in decline. YouTube is popular because one of the most popular categories on YouTube is product unpacks. People buying a product and then recording, unpacking it, and describing what they're finding in there. Hugely important for people who want to effectively see what's in the box without before they buy anything, and making a decision as to whether to buy something based on what they were able to self-discover from someone who's already been through that journey. Well, the fact that that video exists, it can be put to work, because companies that have a YouTube channel can index that as well and bring those same results to bear as part of the self-service experience. So when we think about content, we've got to take a very broad view of where videos live. YouTube obviously super popular, whether those are on learning management systems or indeed on a company's YouTube channel really shouldn't matter. All of this is helpful content that customers are showing preference for in terms of how they engage with it. And I would far rather, as an organization, know that I'm starting to curate that and bring it to bear and proactively offer it up to my customers, and the data showing me that it's useful, than have them have to go find it themselves and kind of go away from my site, when in fact I could be providing that content to them proactively.
Now, in terms of integrating Coveo into organizations, obviously organizations have got lots of other applications driving other bits of service and customer interaction. How easy is it to integrate Coveo into existing sort of legacy systems?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to be glib, because every customer is different, but we put a lot of time and effort and frankly, people years into building out a body of connectors that enable us to connect to various repositories of information, things like CRM systems, Dropbox, G Drive, OneDrive, as well as a series of tools that enable us to connect to things that are perhaps a little older or bespoke or custom that we haven't got a connector for. And that enables us to effectively couple to those systems and start to index the information that exists within them. So the fact that these connectors exist out of the box means that starting to build that index is a relatively straightforward process. We host this information, so it doesn't require a physical implementation of systems. If people don't want to do that, we have that option. And the analytics is run in the Coveo cloud. So again, there isn't a need for any infrastructural investment to do this. That's all managed by Coveo in our cloud. Those recommendations and search results and responses are driven from the Coveo cloud as well. So the point is that because it's a cloud service, there isn't the burden of having to build out a whole set of infrastructure just to begin. Now, if there are firms that wish to, have things like that index inside their own data centers for reasons of, I don't know, corporate policy or fiscal prudence or frankly legislative requirement, we have that ability to help them with that too. But that tends to be, a more sophisticated implementation. Most folks we see that we work with, we're actually hosting everything for them in the cloud, and it means that their time to value is significantly faster.
And just a final question. We've touched on metrics quite a few times, both in this Q&A and in your presentation, Mark. But if people are looking for a single metric to focus on in terms of sort of building the business case for investing in building out customer self-service, would it be on the customer experience side, or would it be on the cost side, or do you have to mention both when you're building a business case? What do you see when you're working with clients, Mark, the sweet spot is in terms of getting sort of buy-in internally?
Yeah, we typically see what very often drives this initially is a cost reduction of or a cost prevention of trying to not grow a contact center any bigger than it already is. Why? Because that's something that's probably already being very closely measured by the customer service operations team. And clearly, if a company is in rapid growth, they want to, for example, see growth in their subscriptions and top line, but ideally exponentially, but have a much more linear approach to maybe their growth in support. And so what they see is this potential issue of the more we grow, the more our cost rise. Can we flatten that? So that tends to be a primary driver, and we've seen that with many of the software firms, for example, that knew they were providing a subscription model. People like Salesforce, people like Adobe, all of whom are customers, went through that very same journey. So that it was trying to anticipate a cost flattening process that was the initial catalyst. And from there, obviously realizing that the more customers could look after themselves, then they also had metrics that proved out how to justify doing even more self-service. So it tends to start there. We've found that when you go through those TSIA numbers that we showed at the beginning, I think most people are skeptical of, okay, I'm going to see a revenue change immediately, because that's not something that they can necessarily quickly measure. They tend to buy initially on that cost, but with the promise of enhancements on revenue later.
Mark, time has beaten us. Thank you very much indeed. Very insightful presentation and Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want more information about Coveo and their market leading innovation solutions, go to coveo.com. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for spending some of your time today to attend this webinar. I hope to have your company again at another Directors Club event. You can visit directorsclub.org.uk for all the latest event information. Until next time, I'm John Snow, and this has been a Directors Club United Kingdom presentation.